Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Ajoy Bwajapong. I'm the Seminar Coordinator at CSPS. And this afternoon, we have with us Dr. Folashadé Soulé, who is a Senior Research Associate at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford, and a visiting scholar at the Legon Center for International Affairs and Diplomacy, LESIAD. So currently, her research focuses on China-Africa relations and South-South cooperation, and the study of agency in Africa's international relations. So her presentation today is looking at Chinese mining and infrastructure projects and the socioeconomic impact of that. Dr. Soulé, thank you very much for your availability. We are looking forward to an interesting discussion, and thank you all of you for joining.
Meaning that China exports more to African countries than the other way around. And also this trade is mostly concentrated, and largely, I would say, concentrated in large countries, like Kenya, South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, and to some extent to medium-sized countries like Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and so on. And so in this relationship, it's also mostly concentrated in some, let's say, Africa exports more agricultural goods to and raw materials to China, whereas they import more, African governments, countries import more trade manufactured goods. So in this regard, China is also Africa's largest creditor. And as you can see, well, there are talks, as you may have heard from the news, on Chinese debt in Africa, but in a debt crisis. However, what you can see from this data is from the China-Africa Research Initiative, Johns Hopkins University. What you can see from this is that, well, there's diversification, right? There's variation, especially from one African country to another. Countries like Nigeria, Cameroon, Angola, South Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, to some extent, are more indebted to China than Mali, Burkina Faso, Algeria, and so on. There's also a sectoral diversification. Most of the loans are in the transport, infrastructure, power, and mining sector, and a bit less in health, education, and so on. However, what you can see from these graphs is that China is hyperactive in the sense that they provide, they are present in all the different sectors. In the Cold War period, it was mostly like agricultural, technical cooperation, and now Chinese infrastructure and mining projects and all kinds of, even non-material cooperation is what you can find in, even political parties cooperation. So China's really become this large hybrid partner and to many extent has surpassed the former colonial powers in Africa, especially in terms of infrastructure provided. So in terms of the infrastructure project, there are three types of projects. There are the ones that are funded by concessional loans, allocated, and most of them are allocated to Chinese companies. So it's this like loans versus infrastructure or resources for infrastructure loans. Then there's a second type of project that are executed by Chinese contractors, but that are on African budgets. And this is something that many people don't know, is that most of the Chinese projects, like the official ones, government-to-government projects, are on African national budgets. And the second tier is on loans by Exim Bank and so on. And so the third type of infrastructure project comes from Chinese contractors that have won bids by also by the West African Development Bank or like national development banks or even the World Bank. So it's important to understand, to make this distinction between the different types of loans. So the bigger picture, and this graph comes from the African Development Bank Infrastructure Consortium for Africa, is that, as you can see, this is what I meant earlier on, is that African national governments are the ones that provide the most funding to their national infrastructure projects, whether it comes from China or others. China is the third-tier provider here, as you can see. So, and also the private sector. So, in this context, how do African actors exercise agency? So in the study of agency, whether it's from African actors or others, there are three things to keep in mind. First of all, what type of actors, the context, and also the different tools, the resources that they have to exercise agency. In the case of African actors, it's important to specify the specific sets of actors. When we talk about African agency, who are we talking about? Is it the presidential cabinet, the ministers, the senior level officials, the bureaucrats, the entry level or mid-level bureaucrats? It's important to identify these. Also, the context, when does this, and what is the context when it's happening, right? It's agency is exercised over the flow of time, meaning that depending on the economy, depending on the power that's in place, and many other factors, the exercise of agency is variable. And finally, there's also the question of the repertoires of action, since what are the different tools that they are using. The president, officials from the presidential cabinet, the president himself, will have different tools to exercise agency than others. So these elements are important to keep in mind, and I will elaborate on that further on. So the research questions for this study are fearful. Do infrastructure projects on Chinese loans, especially those who necessarily limit the exercise of agency by the African borrower? Also, what are the socioeconomic impact of these engagements in Africa? And finally, how can African actors exercise more agency in this context? So in terms of the types of African agency, there are multiple ones, as I said, there's presidential ones, the executive ones, agency that's more like the executive and the ministerial level as well. And bureaucratic agency is mostly the officials, and non-state agency is mostly organized civic agency like CSOs, alliances, coalitions, but you also do have sporadic expressions of civic agency, riots, protests that are not necessarily organized as the ones by CSO. So there are different levels of these. So concretely, in the case of Africa-China relations, there are large infrastructure projects, as you can see here in Kenya, where most of these projects were executed and pushed forward by the president. Kenyatta in Kenya really pushed for the SGR project to be launched, railway project to be launched. And all of this happens also when there's this need by an African. Let's say there are also many electoral reasons, but internal political reasons for them to engage as military with China and to push for these projects to happen. At the bureaucratic level, the bureaucratic agency takes place mostly during the negotiations as well as the different expertise that is associated to these projects. And also how different rounds of negotiations are organized. And what I've seen in my research is how internal coordination allows for better negotiation process by the bureaucrats, and also how avoidance of corruption is also something that is necessary for better negotiation processes. So, however, the question here also is, what is the social impact, right? The social impacts, especially the workers on all these projects. And what you can see from this graph is from an article written by Carlos Goya from SOAS University is that the Chinese, let's say, low-skilled and semi-skilled workers are, like African workers, are less present on Chinese projects than on other foreign projects. So, but it depends, right? It's very important, especially when we talk about China and Africa, to unpack and look at it from a sectoral perspective. In the manufacturing sector, there are more, let's say it's almost equal between Chinese and, other foreign workers on manufacturing, low-skilled workers. And on, the construction one, there are more like foreign workers than Chinese workers. However, what you can see is that, and this is the case of Angola, is that on manufacturing low skill, there's almost none Angolan workers, whereas in the construction sector, there are many more. There are also variations at the semi-skilled levels where there are more Angolans also and other foreign workers on manufacturing projects, but there are less on the construction side. And one of the reasons for that from this article is that there are, it depends on the labor regimes. The labor regimes also in China, meaning the way within China, the labor regimes are organized and the extent to which they allow for, more external workers has an impact on, it also says how they behave in Africa. So this is something also to keep in mind, and it shows the variations. Another sector that I haven't shown here is the tech sector. In the tech sector, for instance, there are more local workers, meaning whether they are low-skilled, semi-skilled workers, but also high-skilled workers from African countries than the other way around, whereas this is less the case in other sectors. So this is an important element. So something here that I want also to mention is the environment impact. In the mining projects, there's much more criticism, but there are different layers, right? So in the case of Galamsey in Ghana, in the case of like there's a province called Kambele in the eastern region of Cameroon. You do have many Chinese workers that operate there, and they operate in a very, let's say, sometimes unseen by even the Chinese officials. Because when we talk about China and Africa, there are the large government projects, but at the same time, there are also many Chinese small and medium enterprises, private actors that come in, and try to find projects to work, like in small investments to make in Africa. And very often they escape the control of the larger states, but also, the larger Chinese, the larger Chinese embassy and economic mission. And so in terms of the impact on the environment, there are many. In the case of Ghana, I think this has been very much documented on the impact that this has on the environment, also on health, on education, and these patterns are also the same in Cameroon in the region, because the way some of these projects are executed are very harmful to the environment. However, one thing that is important to specify here is that is the role of local patronage in this. They also play this liaison role. And by local patronage, I mean like the local African chiefs, some of the, some officials within the government. They also play this facilitator role for the Chinese SMEs. And very often, some of these enterprises are even hold, in terms of the permits by nationals, like African nationals, whether it's Ghanaian nationals, Cameroonian nationals, and so on. So this is important to understand also that the impact, the damageable impact on the environment is also due to this local patrons that play this role and that benefit from this relationship more that is harmful to the environment in many cases. So what is important to highlight here is what in this context, how can African countries have more agency in dealing with all these issues? First of all, this is the first variable that I mentioned. It has to do with bureaucratic coordination, right? The bureaucratic capacities, the internal coordination on this project, meaning when there are harmful effects, harmful impacts that I mentioned earlier, this is also because there's sometimes fragmented negotiation, or there are breaches that are exploited by these actors. Secondly, the intervention of the presidency or the cabinet has impacts on the variation of the outcome. You know, when there's a president or like the executive is more diligent on these issues, then the impact also is better. And so this is not to say that everything that China does is harmful to the continent. There are many positive elements, especially in terms of how there are many opportunities also, economic opportunities that come with the Chinese presence. However, the lack sometimes of enforcement of the regulation can have harmful impacts on African countries. And finally, depending on the nature of the political regime and system of governance, there are also these also bring the load of effects, because taking the example of Ghana versus Cameroon, in the case of Ghana, the fact that Ghana is a democratic country with civil society organizations that can, and also media that can voice, all these concerns loudly and that can be discussed openly, allows also for these issues to be taken into account. Although, there are some, it's not totally perfect. However, it allows for an open debate around this. Whereas in the case of Cameroon, where it's more of an authoritarian system of governance, this has an effect on also some let's say less voice. The opportunity for voicing all these concerns is less the case. Another element is also the centralization and decentralization. When there's too much decentralization, it sometimes constrains the efforts for coordination on these issues and allows for other actors, to exploit this point. So I think these elements are to make like a larger sum up. These are the different variables that allow for more or less positive or negative impacts from these projects on African countries. So thank you very much for listening. I'm open to any questions that you may have, and please let me know if any comments or questions that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Doc, for this presentation. So now we are going to open up for comment and questions and input. You can raise a hand or you can send a chat. Okay, Christopher, you can start.
Thank you very much, Prof. It was really an insightful session and very brief and concise. But I have some few questions and challenges I would like you to address. There are about 4 of them. I'll be very quick. The first being that when we look at the slide where you talked about agency, the different type of agency, Can you please highlight further the main difference between the executive agency and bureaucratic agency? And does the bureaucratic agency influences the executive agency? Because in my opinion, the bureaucratic and the what you term the executive of individual agency is more or less one and the same. So kindly expatiate on that. And secondly, why is the low-skilled worker little to none, is having a rate of little to non-African, looking at the rate of poor educational attainment in Angola, as compared to the manufacturing semi-skilled worker? I find it very interesting. Does that mean that the Chinese are not actually paying attention to the cheap labor and the low educational standard in Angola, for them not to utilize the skills, the non-skilled workers in Angola? Thirdly, I have a question on Galamsey. I am trying to think whether we can apply the model used in Angola in Ghana, and it's on the question of Galamsey. So is it a low, just a second, please, I stated this down. Oh, sorry, I'll let that out. So on the borrower agency, do you think we should have a continent-based and state-level unity, more like a Pan-African bureaucratic coordination system to improve the outcome of negotiation in terms of transnational projects? Because I will use the example of the railway in East Africa in East Africa, the Tazara Railway. When I was in Leiden, I did something around that, a certain paper I looked at. So do you think it is necessary for we to have a Pan-African agency? Because it appears to me that when I looked at your model of borrower agency, everything there is on state level. Do we need to have a unified approach to negotiation and actions across Africa when we're making our partnership with China? Thank you.
Thank you very much for these comments and questions. So very briefly, I will discuss, well, first of all, the executive and bureaucratic level. I can elaborate on that. I wrote an article about that as well. It's what the executive that I identify is mostly at the ministerial level, right? It's some of the cabinet members and so on, whereas the bureaucratic level is a few levels below, like medium level, entry level like bureaucrats. What I noticed in these projects is that very often it's at the bureaucratic level that these contracts are more or less, elaborated, but they are discussed and decided at the higher level, of course. So bureaucratic agency happens in the sense that when these different technical layers of the bureaucracy are associated to the project, because before being bureaucrats, they do have an expertise, right? And so when their expertise is mobilized and utilized during the negotiation sessions, there is more agency coming from them. On the other hand, what I've noticed also in some African countries is that they can also play they can contest some of these projects at the bureaucratic level, by making coalitions with civil society organizations, and that's more the case in democratic countries. They can utilize all kinds of weapons, all kinds of instruments, within the bureaucracy to protest that they are not happy with some of the deals that are very much politically motivated. So there's where I see the difference, at the bureaucratic level. At the more, let's say, presidential and larger, like executive level, the differences are that, well, they have more of the say to make, to take the decisions, actually. So the hierarchies within the bureaucracy do have an effect for that. And that's why I didn't want to encompass all of them, within a single basket. About Angola, the difference between the low skilled and the medium skilled, I think where it happens is that let's say it's also how some of these, it's not only the labor regime in coming, with this Chinese project, but it's also how these projects are negotiated by the host governments, how, skills like local context, right? And also technology transfer are negotiated. And so when these are negotiated well, and this also depends from one sector to another. So that's why there are also these variations. So it depends on both levels. And yes, I mean, on the Galamsey, the model of Angola, I think, one thing that I wanted to highlight by using the Galamsey example is, the role of local patronage. I think this has a lot of effects on and explains the variation from one country to another in terms of models. So, there's this interesting paper by Nathaniel Okoye on the London School of Economics, where he investigates the role and agency of local patrons in explaining, the persistence of illegal Chinese mining in Ghana. And he argues that it's really the results of this collaborative effort between local patrons and Chinese miners that's categorized as comrades, comrades in need and comrades with power, and how these local patrons are key to the successful absorption of Chinese miners into the political economy of illegal mining in Ghana. But this is very much at the small scale level. So at the larger scale level, where there's more enforcement of regulation, I see less of these issues taking place. Galamsey has evolved. It usually was an ancestral practice, almost non-harmful to the environment and livelihoods. And now it's more large scale with the introduction of all these new techniques that are brought in by the Chinese that are much more harmful. And so this is really a case of lack of national regulation and enforcement, and also the role of local patrons. And finally, borough agency and the role, the let's say more harmonization of practices, something larger. There have been many attempts for that, and there are discussions on the at the ECOWAS level, for instance, but also there is an African Union-China dialogue as well. However, the issue is at two levels. First of all, China is very much keen on engaging on a bilateral level with African governments. They really hate what they call gangs, right? Coalitions. And so this bilateral way of operating has an impact on also how African governments engage with them. And one thing that is important to keep in mind is that African countries are in competition with one another for investments. And since they're in competition, this doesn't also allow them to look at it at a more larger level, like how can we harmonize more? And this issue of, Pan-Africanism, using Pan-African institutions or larger institutions for better regulation is something that happens across sectors. There are some, if I take the example of more like social or societal issues, there's where I've seen more this coalition building among African countries. Take the example of racism against African students in China, racism against African workers as well. There's where at FOCAC level, like the Forum of China-Africa Relations, where there are more coalition. But when it comes to investments, competition tends to take over.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you, Folashadé, for this for the response. We have hands raised, Prof. Nanekia and Yudoho, and then Emmanuel. And then you can take them together.
Okay. Thank you. This was interesting. If you would put up the slide, if you don't mind, while I'm asking my question, the slide on the three variables or the three factors that mediate the amount of agency that countries have. So I found it striking, the third one about centralization versus decentralization, because I'm used to thinking of centralization as a good thing and more centralization as even better, because it reduces the power, obviously at the center and in the hands, particularly of the presidency and the larger executive. So I understand your explanation about too much decentralization can constrain coordination efforts, but how much of it is good? Like to what extent? Because again, the more central these processes are, the more that a smaller group of people have control over the process. And as you mentioned in another part of your presentation, these investments tend to be also personal political projects on the parts of presidents and so on. So what's a good balance?
Well, what I've noticed is that it's during the negotiation of these projects mostly, where decentralization has let's say a harmful impact, right? So I'm talking in terms of practices. A harmful impact is also when there is a lack of coordination within the government. So let me give you some concrete examples. When Chinese companies, the state-owned enterprises, coming together because they always operate, as and speak as one very often in these negotiations with, like the Chinese ambassador, representatives from the economic mission. What does happen is that when they try to get via one door, let's say the Ministry of Finance, and they don't get what they want, they will try to go and try and make these deals directly with line ministries, with technical ministries. And in the case where normally when it comes to China-Africa relations within the government, there should be more coordination on who gives the final yes. But if take the example of Benin Republic, where I'm from, under the former government, he was putting the president was putting his ministers and in competition to get deals. So the Ministry of Public Works, for instance, would be very keen to sign a deal with China without associating the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Finance. And because the decentralization of like power, decision, and so on, it's at that level that I'm really talking about. Also, decentralization opens the door to all these kinds of practices. Whereas in the case of Ethiopia and Cameroon, where there's this one-stop shop for all the deals with China, when the Chinese negotiators are not happy with something and they try to get via other doors or the windows and so on to get these deals signed, they are constantly sent back to this one-stop shop. So there's where I talk about, how this might affect the negotiations, the way internal coordination and how, sometimes the decentralization and centralization of some sectors can be harmful to some extent on the outcome of the negotiation process.
Thank you. Prof, do you have a follow-up, or I should move to Emmanuel?
Well, from what you're saying, then it sounds more like it's about coordination than decentralization. So I'm wondering whether I'm misunderstanding decentralization then in that sense. It sounds more like as long as there is some coordination and people are talking amongst themselves
well,
about the best deal to get. Yes, please go on.
Yes, that's why I was making this distinction between, it's not like the centralization and decentralization in the core, political definition. It's how the governments within are organized and how this can lead to fragmented negotiation. So sometimes coordination is requested, but is not enforced. Right. So there's where the issue lies mostly. So I do agree with you that there's this, distinction to make.
Yes. Thank you. That's much clearer and very helpful.
Thank you, Prof. Emmanuel. Hello, Emmanuel. You can come in with your question. if you can hear me.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Folashadé, for this insightful presentation. My question will be on the first part of your presentation, the Chinese mining and infrastructure project in Africa. I saw the slides you put up disaggregating the kinds of investment, and largely transport was leading, followed by power and then mining. My question will be on transport. In your research, do you find that the Chinese investment is going into transport infrastructure that is cross-border? For example, the Chinese funding projects from Accra to maybe Cotonou, or funding a railway project from, let's say, from Lagos to another capital city nearby, or these are projects that are within the borders of a particular country. I ask this question also because of my interest in how infrastructure will impact on free trade agreements as we have signed in Africa. So that's my question.
Yes. So yes, there are many, let's say most of the projects are in country, but there are some large projects that are, let's say, that where China pledged for funding and where they are putting up, different countries together, for more transnational, cross-regional transport. There's also this, that's more also in the oil sector. There's also in the oil sector where there's this pipeline from Niger, for instance, to Benin. And by the way, this might be of interest to you, is that one of the reasons why Burkina Faso decided to switch, by recognizing the One China policy and stopping this the diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, is also because they were convinced about this packet of, this package of different regional, intra-regional projects that China would bring, and so on. So, but I could send you a list of these cross-regional projects, because there are many, and this is something that is discussed quite a lot also during the larger forum for China-Africa relations.
Okay, thank you.
I will be very happy for the list. So I will kindly get your email address so that I will send you an email, and we will continue the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I see that Christopher's hand is also up again. So Christopher.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. So far for your answers and presentation. Just in pursuant to what Professor Emmanuel just stated, you see, the reason I asked for a continent-based agency is with regards to, yes, the AFCFTA, Africa's Development Agenda 2063, what have you, but in relation to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, it's a cross-continental project. It's the largest the world will ever see if it come to be. So I'm just wondering, why is there not, you've stated, yes, there is, but maybe probably when you share the list, then we can get a better view. Because for me, it is quite important, not just to see competition amongst African states for infrastructural projects, but also coordination at continental level for continental level projects. So that is why I asked. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I fully agree with you. I think this is something that I've seen also across sectors. I mean, whether it's the tech sector, whether it's trade. However, again, like I mentioned this earlier on, this question of investments that the countries want to attract, and sometimes also the fact that we're talking about free trade agreements. They are, well, many of African countries have signed, the AFTA deal, and they are implementing it. At the same time, there are also several bilateral of free trade agreements, between China and Mauritius, between the US and Kenya, between China and Kenya. So what is happening here is this overlap of, this like spaghetti regionalism, right? This overlap of all these initiatives, more or less at an advanced stage of negotiation, more or less at an advanced stage of enforcement. So yes, I agree with you that, that would be ideal, but what we are seeing in practice is that the institutions that are supposed to do this coordination of Pan-African agency, they do of Pan-African, coordination. They do this at a level where, they also are limited, in terms of their power. This goes to question of sovereignty, right? Who is willing to give more sovereignty to these institutions and also to enforce regional agreements above the national ones. So yes.
Okay, thank you, Prof.
Thank you. Any follow-ups on this, or let me see if there's any hands up. Okay, not yet. All right. So I'm also wondering if you could shed a bit of light on how different governance systems are, because I remember you mentioned democratic governance and then autocratic ones, and how they play out differently. Some people may argue, because we see a lot of Chinese investments here that people are not particularly happy about, but then we have a democratic state. So I'm just trying to ask if you could if you have any concrete examples or evidence on that, or is based on an assumption?
Yes, well, what I meant by democratic versus autocratic is the extent to which agency can be exercised by, let's say, non-presidential actors and non-state actors. If you take the example of like two neighboring countries like Benin and Togo, in Benin, under the former government, it was more possible, even for, let's say, civil servants unions to coalesce with civil society organization, because they were not happy about a Chinese funded project that was heavily politicized, and so they made it very vocal, going to the National Assembly, going to the media, using very popular radio shows. In Ghana, it's the same. So the democratic environment allows for more voice by these actors. Taking even the examples of cartoonists, right? And taking the example of all these non-state actors that can voice their concerns. So that allows for the questions to be taken into account. Whereas in other countries, I took the example of Togo, but also of Cameroon, when populations are not happy, or even within the government or at the local governance level, they are not happy with some of these Chinese projects, it's more difficult for them to voice this and to bring solutions. And sometimes, we are not even aware of the gravity of what's happening. If you go to Eastern Cameroon and Kambele region, it's even worse, because the media is not allowed to some extent to do their job, to report all of this. So there's where I see let's say the variation between the type of regimes, of political regimes within these countries, and how this affects, how this has an effect on Chinese projects as well in the region, and local ownership, local concerns, how they are voiced and so on.
Okay, thank you very much. Kofi, you can come in.
All right, thank you very much. I just want to follow up on the issue about democracy and autocracy. I think we may need to kind of problematize that distinction a lot more. Of course, a question has been raised about the difficulty of, citizens' preferences translating into policy, into democracy.
Kofi, are you there? We can't hear you. Yeah, we lost you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes. You just repeat the last.
Okay. All right, sorry, the internet in my office is very bad. So if we take China, which is often characterized as an autocratic state, when there was the protest over COVID restrictions, it wasn't clear whether they were going to respond, but they actually did. And interestingly, that was framed as a sign of weakness. When you compare that to Canada, the tracker protest, it was brutally shut down, including closing down of the bank accounts of those who were involved in the protest. Of course, if you take the Ghanaian case, where the political system has been characterized as competitive clientelism, the understanding there is that government is more likely to respond by giving out freebies, so subsidies and whatnot, rather than actually responding to policy preferences or programmatic policy. In that case, using the democracy authoritarian distinction might actually be misleading because it may not tell us really how government is likely to respond on particular policy issues. Anyway, so that's just the...
Yeah. So what I meant by making this distinction is in terms of the exercise of agency, right? That's one thing. Now, the impact of this agency is another one. So it doesn't mean I'm not saying that because in democratic settings, civil society actors, populations are more able to voice their concerns, that this necessarily means that the government will, react in the right way. So that's something else. So in terms of the impacts of that, I think it depends, from one country to another. However, in terms of voicing it and bringing it to the table, there's where the distinction is interesting to look at. So if you ask me the question now about the impact of this agency in democratic settings, it's very variable. The different examples that I've used earlier on in the World Project and so on, there were some cases where the government, they acceded to the demands of the populations. It's also the case in other countries, and intervened, right, at the more executive and presidential level. There are other cases where there was this, there were more, there was a lack of intervention, and this is very often for political reasons, like a road project in a very specific region, in a context. That's why I mentioned also the context, like electoral reasons, like elections are coming in 1 or 2 years. Very often governments tend to go with the Chinese because they are said to be very quick, and fast in the execution. And there are many issues related with that as well, because the quality is not always there when this happens. So the other variables can then come in, right? Elections, politicization, corruption, and so on. But in terms of the expression of dissatisfaction, this is something that you will see more in democratic settings because of the nature of the political issue.
Okay, thank you. Kofi, do you have a follow-up?
No, I think I'm fine.
Okay. Nanika.
Yes, just following up on this interesting discussion about agency. I think we have this sense, I'm talking about ordinary people who don't do research on this. We have this sense that China's interests are not our interests or oppositional to the interests of African countries. That's sort of the, public wisdom. And so when we hear state agency, we assume, therefore, the states that state agency or the exercise of state agency will be in the interest of the people. And hearing you and Kofi have your conversation, I'm questioning that for myself. Why would I assume that the fact that the states can exercise more agency in these negotiations means that it will be good for the people of that state. I'm realizing that I'm conflating state agency with the better interest of the citizens, and that's not necessarily the case. So, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think that there's this tendency to, and maybe I should have mentioned that as well. So this is a very important comment that you're making. So the agency is not necessarily positive, right? When you take the example of, when you take the definition of agency, that is to exercise its influence, or whether your actions can have, an impact that is of interest to the actor or the agent. This can also be seen as, let's say agency is twofold, I would say, right? There's self-interest, and there's the agency that's directed towards like the larger good, like to the others. And when there is like presidential interference, let's say when it's for like bringing in the right expertise for better negotiation, that's something that has more positive outputs. But when it's about building like very quickly and harshly, like a road in a district because it's important for the persons there to get like road access, and for the president to have like electoral gains, then that's self-oriented. So I think it's important when we talk about agency that it shouldn't be considered right away as something, congratulatory, like militant, and so on. The motivations behind the exercise of agency are very different from one place to another.
Thank you. This is very interesting. I can take the last question from Antoinette.
Thank you very much, Ajua. And thank you very much, Dr. Folashadé. I actually missed a lot of your presentation. I just couldn't connect, but I'm so interested in what you're talking about, because I see that there's always this nexus, Chinese mining investment in Africa. I don't know if this came in your presentation, but somehow, did you find anything? There's always this contentious thing that the Chinese would do infrastructure development in Africa if they can get natural resource agreements to be lenient for them. So did you find anything like that? Were concerned or anything like that? Thank you.
So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking if Chinese investment is self-motivated, or sorry, I didn't get the.
Yes, or is it tied to, is any of the infrastructure investments and what you're talking about, is it ever tied to anything about that we put this infrastructure for you and you give us, a more lenient mining lines, mining lease, that kind of thing?
Yes, it's always, absolutely. When China talks about win-win, win-win cooperation with China and Africa, that is what it's about. It's mostly about all these interests. It's access to resources. It's outputs for their own national companies, state-owned companies that are trying to also to internationalize, whether it's state-owned companies or provincial Chinese companies. So you do have many of these deals where it's resource for infrastructure. Like take the Sino-Hydro bauxite deal in Ghana. That's one example. So the exploitation of bauxite, and then outputs are infrastructure and so on. So yes, this is not like a free gift. Well, there are gifts, but even gifts, right? If you take the muscle-mouse sociological approach to donations, there's always an interest behind it, right? So, but then the larger question is, what are the African interests, and how are these negotiated so that there's common gains, so not common gain, but like that it's less.
That is beneficial to both, yes. Mm. No, please go on. I was saying that in that case, does it become beneficial to both parties?
it becomes beneficial when these countries, when it's better negotiated. That's where the issue lies, when it's better negotiated between African governments and Chinese governments. So and again, there are so many cases going from one country to another that show the differences in these variations. That's yeah, that's what I can say, at least like broadly speaking, right? Because then it's on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Adjoa.
Okay, thank you very much, Antoinette, and thanks, Doc, for the submission. Before we leave, someone is asking if you can share your email. So can I go ahead to do that?
Yes, please do. And just know that I'm based at the University of Ghana now as a visiting scholar. So I can meet if anyone wants like more of an interview or so. So yes, this is my address. You can share it. Thank you.
Thank you. On that note, thank you so much for your availability and for all those who attended this seminar. I'm wondering if you would want to have some last words on this. I mean, what I'm taking home is the fact that agency is not always positive. So I think that win-win, some skeptics like us would always be wondering if this win-win is really how does it really play out? But of course. So Doc, would you want to have any last words, or we can just wrap up like that?
Well, I think that you've summarized it very well, like the differences between like how it's important. I would say first not to consider the exercise of agency necessarily as something like self-congratulatory and militant. Agency, first of all, it's a sociological concept. It's so it definitely it's double-oriented or multi-oriented. And in the case of China-Africa relations, I think it's important to keep in mind the different elements, but also I would say to come up with more, to unpack everything. Right? That's why I made all these distinctions, like sectoral distinctions, also in terms of the skills, the different environmental impacts, the type of political regimes, and then the nuances that we have to bring in as academics is very important in the discussion of such a topic in large of Africa's international relations.
All right, on that note, thank you. And our last seminar for the semester is on the 10th of August. So we will look forward to all of you to join. And thank you, Dr. Folashadé, for this interesting discussion. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.